Hi everyone, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Welcome to a special live version of my podcast. And today I have three great guests who are going to talk about their amazing ancestors. I have Rich, John, and Evangeline. So welcome everybody. Thanks for being here.
Welcome.
Hello. So Rich, let's start with you. When did your family arrive, and what got you started, and then what's your amazing ancestor story?
Sure, Bob. So I am born and raised in the Little Italy enclave of Philadelphia, and I am 100% Italian American, meaning on my paternal side, my grandparents came from Calabria, settled in Philadelphia. On my maternal side, my grandparents came from Puglia. So I've got Pugliese and Calabrese roots. From our genealogy research, it was like 1902, 1910 they came. Some of my grandparents came in Ellis Island, but also Philadelphia, the port of Philadelphia. So besides Ellis Island, besides Boston, besides Baltimore, since family was already here in Philadelphia, I've got documentation that shows one of my grandfathers, one of my grandmothers physically came to the port of Philadelphia. And the other interesting piece is that when my grandfather came, he started in the coal mines of Western PA, but eventually had his own business, an entrepreneur selling hats. So he was a hat maker. And there's his storefront where I was born and raised above that store. The other interesting piece of our puzzle is that when we did our research, we found that it was the typical chain migration, meaning 1902, 1910, there were families from our comune, di Biccari, already settled in Philadelphia. And then when my cousin did a little bit more research with census records, he found that there were like hundreds of people from that town, first generation, second generation, that were all from Biccari. And he wrote a book about it. So our story sort of, solidifies the word chain migration that you might see in a lot of literature, academic literature, that talks about those people that, set up shop, set up homes, told their family to come here, so on and so forth. Pretty much that's it. From that standpoint, once again, interesting part is, once again, my grandfather did hit the port of Philadelphia physically, as opposed to coming to Ellis Island.
And so now I know you just did your second trip there, right?
Actually, third, Bob.
Third. Even better.
Yeah, and it was wonderful. We've connected with distant relatives that take us in. There's nothing like walking, those alleyways where potentially my ancestors were walking. We went to the mother church. We become very involved with the community. They're very interested in sharing our root stories with them. They want to hear that. So we've had the opportunity to speak as Italian Americans to the residents of Biccari that share descendants distantly with me and some other family members.
So just, so on the hat shop, did they make hats in Italy?
So I don't know the answer to that question. Basically, he started at the large factory in Philadelphia. It was the John B. Stetson Hat Company, probably the largest maker of hats in the U.S. at the time. So he started there. And then as an entrepreneur, like anybody else, he started his own business with his brothers.
Oh, nice. So Jeff had a comment here that he thinks his bisnono came to Philadelphia too, but he hasn't able to prove that yet. So Rich, any insight on how to help Jeff find the Philadelphia family?
Yeah, the National Archives basically had lists besides Ellis Island. They do have the list of the Philadelphia arrivals, right? So you got to dig a little deeper. Once again, my grandmother, I have the piece of paper that says she hit that in 1910. So you got to dig. I mean, Ancestry might have it, Family Search, but I was fortunate to use the National Archives to get that documentation.
Yeah, that's great. And how far back have you been able to go?
So between me and my cousin, it was like 1600, um, and he's got the lineage from that point, definitely to 1880 when my grandfather was born, and we've got the naturalization record, so on and so forth. Um, but yeah, we think we've got our roots definitely solidified, and we know our family history.
Right. And for anybody listening that's from Philadelphia or Biccari, Eric, he wrote a book too about the whole migration, right?
Yeah, and like I said, there were just hundreds of people between the first generation arriving and their children, over hundreds of people that could connect with the town of Biccari.
Well, that's great. And it's I have a photograph of my grandfather's store also with my uncle who was his partner and or my great uncle who was his partner, and my uncle was probably about 13, 14 years old, and it's precious to have something like that. And I have actually beads from my grandfather's shop that are probably close to 100 years old now or something like that.
Yeah, and we get questioned all the time, do we still have hats of my grandfather? I wish we did, because it would be museum pieces, artifacts, But when you think of that time period, that photo is probably circa 1920. I mean, hats was part of the haberdashery, right? Every man that you probably know. So it was a pretty lucrative business at that time. Everybody had a fedora.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. They made a comeback when I was growing up in like the '60s. We wore fedoras once in a while.
Right.
We didn't look as classy as those guys, though. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So, Evangeline, what's your story? I know you come from your family was in Detroit, and you also had some roots in the New York area, also, right?
So my story is quite interesting, I would say, just because I come from such a nomadic background. My mother was from the southern United States and came from like a Romani shell, kind of a mixed ancestry and that traveling tradition. And she met my father in Canada, and when she was about 15, and ended up migrating up there. And my father's mother actually had ended up in Canada from Detroit. And then her mother's side of the family, we found out as time went on around that time period, because so much was happening around this in Ireland with the Protestant, Catholic, different things that were happening. There was that mass migration that was coming from Ireland into Canada. And when her mother was going back and forth to Detroit, when we were going through the ancestry records, we realized something that was interesting, because he had thought that they were Protestant, but they were actually Catholic. But when they were in Canada, their records would read Protestant. And so when we were doing a lot of this research and we were kind of going through this, it was really fascinating, because my father didn't know much about his grandfather, because it was just kind of something that was never really discussed. So as a family, we wanted to do all of this ancestry, this DNA testing, right? Like that was really where I think it kind of started at, because we really didn't know too much uh, about our ancestry. It was just kind of something that my father was pretty clear on where his father came from in the long agricultural tradition. My mother, like I said, had a lot of those Roma, Gypsy type of roots. So when we kind of pulled up this ancestry and everything was all over the map for myself and for my daughter, and my father got all of his results back, it was shocking to him to find out that his great uncle, who was the only surviving relative, his son had also done his ancestry, because he's been aging. And when we got his ancestry panel back, and it was almost all Italian and Middle Eastern and way smaller Irish portion than what they thought, that's when we started going down the rabbit hole. And so by being able to connect with our DNA matches, and then I started getting really into the records because genealogy has always kind of been really fascinating to me. I'm an economist and I'm also in engineering school now. So for a lot of my, I guess, analytical and research, it's always just kind of been something I enjoyed. And my father had, always kind of had that missing piece. So as the technology has advanced, we were able to uncover things that I think at the time was not really able to be uncovered. My great great grandparents, when we found the records coming through New York, and they came through Ellis Island, and they came, and it was 1899, and then my grandfather and his brother, they came with their aunt and their uncle a few years later. They all migrated into Germantown, and my great grandfather and his brother, they served in the First World War, and that's where all the naturalization records, I was able to get that. My mother's family also had a lot of military. My veteran, my husband was in the Marine Corps, so we were stationed in Camp Lejeune for a while too. So this military tradition that I noticed, has always kind of been something strong within the community as you were immigrating. But we had nothing to go off of initially. The DNA was the jump off point. And then from there, we had to really start doing the research. And then the Nadeo name, which is the family name, we were finally able to trace. We were able to look at all the DNA percentages. I was able to reach out and contact people. We were able to pull some stuff. We were able to trace the time that they were in Detroit when he would have met my great grandmother. And during that time period was how that happened. And it started to make sense for my father. Oh, well, this is where all these missing pieces have been. And so we're still kind of green in our genealogy journey, but we were able to get our records going all the way back, pulling also from Italy as well, from that Salerno region, San Cipriano Pesentino, and then Saigifoni, I think, is the other small commune that they were from. And that's actually exactly where the Ancestry DNA was actually able to pinpoint. So that was even more interesting that they were able to get that precise, that when we went and started digging deep into the records, that was exactly where they had came from. So now we've been able to go several generations back, but it's challenging when you only have kind of one elder generation relative. But I'm very grateful that his son had the foresight, because my uncle Eugene is 95. So, it was something that I think has been a family journey. And my father and I are hopefully going to be able to start planning to take some of these trips and kind of go and get some deeper information.
Yeah, and that's when you really, feel connected when you make that trip. So your dad he didn't know that much, huh?
No, he didn't know. He didn't know. And I think because, like, my mother's ancestry was such a mixture, right? I mean, she had, ancestors that were passing for white at a certain point in juncture in American history. She had this kind of Romani child, this gypsy type of background. And then even my father's great grandmother, it seems that they were also Irish traveler. And that was the reason why that migration that was going back and forth between the border. I mean, when you start looking at the historical context of the things that were happening at the time, I think here we are in 2024, and we look at the way that the world serves identity on a plate as something that's very binary, and you start to understand that the world has always been very complex. And I think that that's been the most fascinating thing for me, and the thing that makes me most proud to have that ancestry to that region, because I think Southern Italy shared so much as a connection point for sciences and religion and sharing of information, and so much evolved from these places. And there's so much fascinating history when you really get to dig into it.
Yeah, that's for sure. And when you go there, you kind of see that. You see all this whole mixture of everybody. Just out of curiosity, which DNA test did you do? Did you do Ancestry or?
So we did 23andMe initially, but because I have access to a lot of a lot of these kind of other genetic tools, and looking at these other things, and that you're able to upload your panels from, we did 23andMe as a family collectively, right? So it was my brother, my mother, myself, my oldest daughter, who she's about to be 19. And when we were looking at it, there were some things that I think it got really precise, but then there was some really broad categories. So by using some of these other like GED match or other DNA, like DNA genics is also good too when you start kind of working with your raw DNA, because the majority of these admixture tests, right? I think that sometimes people can, question like, what are you really seeing and why is it really showing up that way? But a lot of it is all math and how they triangulate like that percentage. So I think 23andMe is a really good tool. But I think everybody has to kind of think about their own background, because some of the services are better for certain groups. Like if you have a lot of mixed ancestry, it can be challenging depending on what you choose. But if you have like a strong 100% or close to 100% ancestry, I think ancestry.com can be good for that. But 23andMe was able to get really precise, at least for the Italian community. And that's the thing that I've been realizing, like whatever DNA samples that they have at 23andMe for the Italian community and the diaspora, they know what they're doing, because it seems to be as accurate as what I've seen.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if I sent mine off to them. I think I probably did, but I probably haven't looked in quite a long time. I also sent mine to a Living DNA, which I thought, because they're based in Europe, that they would have a lot more of Italians, but Italians don't do DNA. So
Yeah.
it's nothing. But what's interesting about them is that they give you the mother line and father line.
Yes,
which
we did
is,
that as well. We got that.
yeah, that's really interesting. So what did you find there? I'm curious. What did you find with your mother line?
So my maternal from my mother was this. It's H41A. Of course, my father, because it was through his mother, he wasn't able to know kind of what his what his paternal haplogroup was. But with my uncle Eugene, that's actually how we were able to confirm that his father, his biological father, was who he was, through the other male direct ancestors, because they shared that paternal haplogroup. And it was, matter of fact, I think I actually have, because I pulled a lot of these records, and what we've been doing is we've been compiling almost like a picture book for the rest of the family, so that they can kind of go down their own rabbit holes whenever they feel like doing so. Let me just see if I remember what it was, for my paternal for what that was. But I think that here it is. I believe this. Yep, here we go. So for the paternal haplogroup, it was the IL801. And that kind of gave us everything that we needed to know, um, to be able to match up with kind of the origins of the rest of the family. But I feel like I'm still green in this research, because there is so much conflicting information with some of the DNA stuff. So I think that it can be a good jump off point. I think that it helps people to kind of get a general area to know where to go looking for the records. But you're really going to want to lean on those records. Like, I was really grateful that I got a lot of assistance in being able to pull records from Italy directly, utilizing those tools that are available now online. And then, of course, the US Census records. Ancestry.com is good for those records, but it can be a bit pricey. I always advise people, like, if this is what you're trying to do, try to, block off a couple of months, so that like, you're going to get these records, you're going to pull them, you're going to really go through them, try to, match them up. Because if you kind of just wait, next thing you know, your ancestry bill is going to be a little out of control. But these are also available in different free databases as well. So the technology is there, but going back to basics is really, I think, the only way, because most of these records are not even going to necessarily be available unless you go directly to that. And I think that that's the reason that we've hit the wall until we go back to Italy. But the good news is that the Nadeo family name is pretty concentrated. And the other, that particular region of families, you're able to kind of see that it seems like the more common names, when you go to those names, it can get a little bit more challenging because you're seeing it all over the map. But when you get some of those regional names, that can also help also.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co.
Yeah, and what I found most amazing about my mother's haplogroup, she's uh, U1, and it's almost 100% from the Caucasus. I never would have expected that, because I know they've been in Italy for a very long time. So that was really a shocker to me to find out that going back 10,000 years or whatever it was, there's no Italian. So
You'd be surprised how much, even with my particular maternal haplogroup, like there's a mummy sitting in a museum in Ulster that has our haplogroup, and that was one of the first times that they'd found that when they were doing some of the archaeology in Egypt with those particular haplogroups. So we start to see the human story a little bit more. We had a lot of Cyprus and North African, a lot of Algerian too that came up. My uncle Eugene had way more touch points. That was kind of that Algeria, Tunisia region, and then Cyprus. But then I found out that when I traced one of the great grandmothers that we were able to get in Italy, I believe she was born on Capri. So that could also potentially be how some of that was introduced. But a lot of this migration it starts to, I think, connect us more as a human family when we do that.
yeah, absolutely. And if you haven't heard of it, try My True Ancestry. They do charge, but I think they let you do it for free. What they do is they go to archaeological digs back 10,000 years, 20,000 years, who knows how far, and it's more directional than anything else, but it is really pretty interesting. So John, how about your story? When did the family come, and what did you find?
Well, the story with the Valillo family started in about 1905 when my great grandfather Giovanni came from Campobasso in the Molise region, and I actually, and we've talked about this before on your podcast, is that I didn't get started with my research until after my kids were grown, and mom and dad had passed away, and most of the other relatives are gone, and I tried to rediscover the roots that I had been missing since early in my life when we were exposed to the Italian traditions, and life got in the way after that, and I tried to rediscover that. Did find that Giovanni came over in 1905 by himself, and I looked into his history in my research, and he was born in 1870, and his father died. His father was Paul, and he died about 1878 when Giovanni was 8, and then his mother died when he was 14 in 1884. And so I was wondering who raised him after that point. There's no records that really tell what happened after the age of 14 until he got married in 1896. And the picture is my great grandmother. It's Clotilda. Now, she had 4 children after they got married in 1896, 2 of which survived. There were 2 that had died early in their lives, and I would imagine that with the difficulties that they were having economically and with things that were happening with the family, that was the reason that Giovanni decided to follow a lot of the other people from Campobasso to Cleveland, Ohio. And so he came over in 1905. I didn't know if he would be one of the, what's the term, birds of passage that would come over and go back and come over. But apparently he decided to stay. And Clotilda, his wife, came the next year with the 2 surviving children, and then had 2 more here in the States, in Cleveland, my grandfather Antonio and my great aunt Annunziata, which became Nancy. And so she came over in 1906. Antonia was born in 1907. And the picture is Clotilda. The younger Clotilda was in 1917 when Giovanni died of tuberculosis, and there were no support programs like Social Security or anything to support surviving widows. So she had to quickly remarry, found somebody in Cleveland to get married to, basically 3 months after Giovanni died. And so that picture of her as a younger woman, she was born in 1875. This was 1917 for the picture, was with her new family. And then the picture of her holding the baby is her holding me in 1956. So they had a tough life. She was born, Clotilda was born in a village close by to Campobasso and abandoned. She was one of the babies that were taken to what's the term, ruoto, the wheel that would rotate through a wall, and the mother would deposit her on this wheel. The nuns at a church would move the wheel, take the baby, and then notify the mayor of Campobasso that they had a baby to be given to a family that possibly the mother was still able to provide nourishment to a young baby. So luckily, she did find a family to raise her, and then she grew up and obviously married Giovanni, and they came to the U.S. The records, as many of you know, they came with maybe $10 to their name. If you see the immigration records through Ellis Island, that column that shows how much money they came with would show a lot. Most people, $5, $10. That's all they brought with them. And so it also would show if they could read or write, and neither of them could read or write. So they come here with very little. They come here with no ability to read or write. And the generations following them continued to grow, not only in knowledge, but in economic status. And finally, 3 or 4 generations down, we have the American story. We have the success stories that many of us have been able to experience. This many years after they arrived. Just like Rich said, I've been able to research my family back to early 1600s, late 1500s. A lot of it with professional help by hiring people in Italy to go to the parishes and get the records and put it all together for me. So it's been an amazing journey to find out exactly what your roots are and how far we've come.
Yeah, that's super. That's a great story, John. And I remember you talking about that. So we were joined by Jeff D'Amelio. So welcome, Jeff. And I'm sure you joined because you have a great ancestry story yourself. Yeah.
Well, maybe.
They're all great.
We're Italian, but we're not Italian. My only ancestor is my great grandfather, who married a woman around the corner, around 9th Street, South 9th Street, in Philadelphia, who was of English, Irish, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant background. So my grandfather, who was the oldest, in 1891, he was raised mostly by his mother, whereas his three sisters and his brother were all raised Catholic. And so therefore there's the rift. So we were all, my father's and his sisters and us are all Protestant. And my grandfather never talked about being Italian. He very rarely ever said, he never volunteered any information. We always had to ask. Well, it turned out that he was disowned by his father because he didn't do what his father wanted him to do. His father was a musician / tailor. So we know how he got his money, but we know how he wanted to get his money. But my grandfather wanted to go to school. He wanted to become an accountant. He got a job with a meat distributor down by the river, became the president and retired as the president of the company. He went to school at Wharton in the evening to get his degree. My grandfather would have paid for his tuition at any of the Catholic schools, but he didn't want to go to any of the Catholic schools. So at some point, my great-grandmother was buried in the Catholic cemetery, although she was Protestant, and somehow my great-grandfather got away with that. My grandfather didn't like that, so there was another rift. Turns out there was another woman and a baby, and that's another point of disagreement. So there's a lot of things that we're learning that we never knew because no one ever told us. My father didn't know, or he never bothered to tell us. Some things his older sister seemed to know and told my cousins, but they never told me. So it's just been a struggle to say to a certain extent. And the stories that we were told, I'm learning as I've gone through research that it's not necessarily true either. But.
Well, that's not unusual. Yeah, I've heard several people say the same thing. They heard all of these stories, and then when they did research, none of them were true, or they were either enhanced or significant pieces were left out. So
a lot of omission, I think. I completely empathize with Jeff, with your journey, because there's certain things that weren't talked about, and certain things that, the times were so different. So it's challenging when you're trying to navigate that and still be sensitive to everybody's feelings too.
Yeah. So Jeff, you had said that you're like kind of Italian. So I kind of got lost on that a little bit.
Yeah, we're Italian in our name, D'Amelio. I'm a 10th generation Michener. The Micheners go back all the way to John and Sarah, who worked for William Penn and came to the United States, came to Philadelphia in 1686. Eventually the family settled in Bucks County, which is where we grew up, outside of Doylestown. And eventually that family went to Ohio, so this is my mother's side of the family. So in 1976, my grandmother made that connection with a woman in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, that our Micheners with a T were connected to the Micheners without a T. And lo and behold, we're now we know that we're the same Micheners that we grew up with. Around Doylestown. So that was the impetus for me to find out why don't we know this about the D'Amelios. So that's what I got started. Unfortunately, my grandfather never really said anything. His aunt, who was an old maid, came with his great-grandmother in 89. So they were here when he was born. So she was his aunt was about 13 or something like that. And she never said anything. And she died in 60. So I was 9 years old. And she never really said anything. She lived with my grandfather's old maid sisters, all three of them. And they never talked about that. My grandfather and his sisters didn't seem to have a great close relationship. And I think that's because of the rift with his father and their father. So we didn't see them very often. My father said that when he learned to drive, all he did was drive to cemeteries. And so he drove probably to Yaden to see that cemetery, and then to the German cemetery up in North Philadelphia for his mother's side of the family. So we didn't have a lot of interaction on the Italian side, and none of that information was ever given to us.
Yeah, that's a lot of detective work, I guess.
Yeah. Hey, Bob, if I can add, there was a story that came to mind. So my cousin Eric, as you know, traveled to the Comuni years ago, and he runs into this lady that says, "Hey, I know your family." So she takes him in her house, opens a shoebox with all these photos, right? So my cousin's calling me from Italy. He says, "Hey, I'm in this lady's house that we think is a relative, and these photos she has are of our family." And the bottom line was my grandmother had sent all these postcard type photos of her children, my mom, my uncles, to this lady. And here it is 70 years later, this shoebox is opened miles away in the town of Biccari. And it's my grandmother, showcasing her children that were born in America, the second generation. And Eric's calling me from Italy, and I don't know what to say except that our stories are what the academic people write about, right? This diaspora. And if it wasn't for what you just said, the amazing ancestors that we all share, those stories wouldn't be written. But here we are. You're allowing us to tell it on this platform, and it's a wonderful experience. And I know everybody can share in that because our stories are amazing. They really are.
Yeah,
and some of them are untold still. There's gaps along that line. There's holes. We talk about it. But what if, were they part of the Padroni? Were they birds of passage? Was it chain migration? All of those words that are in those academic journals that I love, I kind of love reading, because I'm saying, you're telling the story of each one of our ancestors. The ones that took that journey, that 14-day, 12-day journey, and we know the history of the steamships and the conditions, and when they hit the Ellis Island or the ports of Philadelphia or New Orleans. So here we are telling our story, and I think that's great that you're allowing us to do that.
My pleasure. I live for this now.
So I can ask maybe of you, Bob, right? Roots and genealogy. You've got to have some roots too in a story to tell.
Yeah. I have lots and lots of amazing ancestors. And if I put this one up here, hopefully it's not sideways, but it is. I was trying to fix it so it's not sideways. Let me try another one. Let me see if this one's still sideways. Yeah, they're both sideways. Anyway, if you turn your head, you'll see 5C, Amelia marrying Nicholas Count Purmalo. And this is kind of what led me on to like one of the most fantastic journeys that anybody could possibly have. Growing up, I was always told, in fact, we have what I refer to as his calling card, my great-grandfather, my paternal grandmother's father. And it had his crest on it, and it said that my mother would tell me that he came from a noble family and all of that. And I never really expected to find that much. But as I started to dig into this, what popped up was this record from the Libro d'Oro, which is kind of like the golden book of Italian nobility. And I came across this record, and the names matched because my father was Nicholas, and his grandfather was Nicola, and my oldest aunt was Emily, and her grandmother was Amelia. The date of the marriage matched up and everything, but I couldn't find my grandmother listed, and then it dawned on me, well, of course she's not listed. They didn't list the females, right? Once you hit a female, that was the end of it, right? It was all the males. So I called my cousin that lived with my grandmother, and I asked her if she ever heard the name Caracciolo, and she said, well, of course, that's grandma's name. I said, did you know how famous these people were? And she said, oh yeah, she used to mention things here and there, but we thought that she was just crazy old lady and telling us about her cousin was a princess and all of that kind of stuff. So in this book, and anybody who's lucky enough to find what I found, you could trace this Italian heritage through these families all the way back to, in some cases, the 900s. And it's the case in this Caracciolo family. So as I started digging through, I found out that Amelia's father was the son of a prince, although there were lots of princes in Italy at the time. And he married a woman from Switzerland. And I said, boy, why, how did he wind up marrying this woman from Switzerland? And one day, just digging around the internet, and I tell people all the time, just start, type stuff into the internet. You never know what's going to find. I found this website. They said, if you have Swiss ancestors, write us in German, Italian, or English, and we'll answer you. So I said, well, my great-great-grandmother was Elisa Moore. She married, her father was in the Swiss Guard in Naples in the 1850s, but I can't find anything else. And they sent me the history of all these families in Lucerne, Switzerland. And they had hand-drawn genealogy charts going back, in some cases, to the 1300s. And sure enough, Elisa Moore was on there. And it's all in Latin. So I kind of had to feel my way through there. And, going back in time through this family, they were a mainstay in Naples. And one of the things that I learned was the nobility in southern Italy, the kingdom of the two Sicilies, did not live in their hometowns. They lived in Naples. And they would go visit the hometowns every so often. And once or twice a year, and they also didn't pay taxes. They would collect taxes, but they didn't pay taxes. So as a result, these people were extremely wealthy. Unfortunately, it didn't make none of it made its way to me. When we were there, my wife kept asking me, so where's your share? And I said, well, I'm sure that's long gone. But both my grandmother's families, came from here. But the most amazing thing that I found was this. And that's Prince Marino Caracciolo. He was the Prince of, I'll give you all his titles. Let me see where he is. He was the Prince of Avellino. He was the Duke of Atrapalda, the Count of Torella, and the Baron of San Severino. He owned much of what's currently Campania. And when I saw this photograph, I said, I have a picture of myself that looks like this guy. I was facing the other way, so I had to flip it. I made it black and white, and my sounding board was my wife, and I said, "What do you think about this picture?" And she said, "Oh my God, you look like him. Who is that?" And I said, "It's my ninth great grandfather." So through this family, I've been able to connect to just, all the houses in Europe for the most part. And never in a million years did I ever expect to find something like that. People say, well, there's millions and millions of people that are related to these, people. And I said, well, yes, of course that's true. I know that's true. I said, but be able to be lucky enough to find it, especially through an Italian family. We always think of the gateway ancestors through America that, lead back to England and the kings of England and all that kind of stuff. So it's been an amazing journey. Conversely, my mother's family were farmers in Torito Bari. And had they never came here, they never would have, even if they lived in the same area, they never would have been connected because of the socioeconomic differences. They were so far away from each other. It never would have happened. But, that's the blessing of coming to America is that, we don't have any of that kind of stuff. So before we go, I'd like to ask everybody, if anybody listens and wants to start, whether they're starting their Italian research or any other nationality, what should they do first? Rich?
I mean, you got to get on Ancestry, Family Search, start a file. You got to have some organizational skills going. And like I said, pieces will come together, pieces won't come together. You got to keep digging. I've heard the word journey. It is a journey. It's a fabulous journey. Sometimes you uncover, I call it skeletons in the closet, good things, bad things. 1918, we know, was the Spanish flu. There were infants that passed away. They show up on the census. The next census, they don't show up. So, then you find a death certificate, maybe. And then you say, where is that person buried? I mean, it goes on and on and on, where you want to search for records. So it's a journey, but it's a fun thing. But you can trace your ancestors, and that's what we're fortunate to do, especially if you want dual citizenship, and I know John's done that. So, it's and or you can write a book about it, like my cousin Eric did, the new Paese, where these, once again, chain migration, hundreds from that same town come on over. We've established ourselves. You can live on the same street, the same house. We know where you can get a job. Were they part of a padrone? Where there was contract laborers, and we know how all of that played out. So, our ancestors are the ones that, built America, so to speak.
Absolutely. John, how about you?
Well, we have an Italian genealogy club in Cleveland called CHOW, Cleveland Italian Ancestry Organization. And Rich has started one in Columbus too. Also, conveniently, because Columbus starts with a C, it's also CHOW. We like to tell new members, if they're lucky enough to have another generation older than them, to please sit down with them and get as much information as they can. Get the stories now while they're still alive. And even if you have siblings who are not that interested in genealogy or researching your history, talk to them, see if they know of any other family stories, to get the basic information so that someday you can pass it on either to your kids and grandkids or your nieces and nephews. But that information needs to be put together as soon as it can, and then take that and, like Rich said, get started in the free genealogy sites like Family Search, and you can go to a local library, and they have subscriptions to Ancestry and MyHeritage and many other genealogy websites that you can get on for free at your local library. So it shouldn't be holding you back if you cannot purchase a membership to any of these websites. And then, like I did, take it further. A lot of times the information stops in the early 1800s because that's the secular records that are available on, it's a website called Antenati. It's the Italian website for historical records. And you would have to actually either go yourself, like Rich and I have, and gone back to Italy a number of times to do this research, or hire somebody that's a professional to go to the churches, because the churches will have information back to perhaps the 1500s.
And John, you're the first person. I never heard that or never even thought about it, that the libraries would have these subscriptions. That's a super piece of advice for sure for anybody who's getting started and just wants to check it out. So Evangeline, how about you?
I want to echo what Rich had said about being organized because I had to really create like Google Drives and kind of, I had so many screenshots in my phone by like halfway through. It was crazy. So I think that the best thing that anybody can do is approach this from wanting to bring life. I know, especially as a woman, I've learned that a lot of the stops that we find as women, as we get married, as we migrate, as our children get older, we evolve, and as a society and as a culture, we're now able to bring life and new perspectives to new stories. And when you talk about the class systems, also some of our ancestors, came from places where the records, even with the birth records, it says, the peasant from the town of this. And, you see that we're finally in a place where now we're able to bring these things to life. And I think that just go down all the rabbit holes, right? Like, take a break if you need to take a break, because I know, you can spend a lot of time, but try to keep good notes. I'm still very green. We've been, working to compile. We've got some photos, we've got our documents, and we're planning to put together a book. My uncle Lorne had done a phenomenal one for the Elder family, which is my father's paternal line. And so and he had gone back to, back to Scotland and back to all of these places, and he did that same type of journey. So I was able to kind of pick up where he left off, and use a lot of, those formats. So get organized, get with a group too. I'm very grateful to Bob for, creating spaces, and like what John and Rich are talking about, creating these communities. And, just, you never know what you're going to find. Keep your heart open, but also don't be upset if not everybody else in the family is as interested about this stuff as you are. So, that's why we have these discussions, because, we can all get excited, because sometimes, you rush home and you're like, did you know that I just found out? And they, they're like, yeah, okay, well, the game is on. So, but that organization is key, definitely.
That's great. Yes. I've run across that. My wife's asking me, "You looking for dead relatives again?" Yes, I am. I'm afraid I am. Jeff, how about you?
Well, to echo what John has said, talk to your cousins, because your cousin might have a letter that was written in 1876 from Italy to Philadelphia asking how they were, and don't forget your parents. And if we didn't have that letter, we would never known what town we were from. And that was probably the biggest clue that we have. And that was it. And my cousin has the original. And I never knew this until the 90s. And so why hadn't anybody said anything for the previous 50 years about having this in our possession? And our grandfather never actually knew where his father was from. And yet we had this letter from his grandparents to his father or to his uncle, and we knew where it was from. So you never know.
Yeah, I mean, all super advice. I have a book about my research and a little bit about, both my families, and kind of a little bit of a primer on how to start some research. And I'm certainly no expert. I don't claim to be, but it is a lot of fun. And I would definitely can relate to Evangeline's comment about the crazy people looking for dead relatives again. Well, listen, guys, this has been fantastic. The hour flew by. I had no idea it was going to go by this fast. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks, everybody. Nice meeting everybody.
Yeah.